Healing Half. My name is Mickey Spear. I am a musician, author, and talk show host. Quite simply, The Healing Half is a short, quick timeout during our week where we get to take less than 30 minutes to pause and learn how do we heal our own wounds, as well as learn how to help others heal their own. I think all of us have been in spots where we have felt awkward and we have very much felt like we don't know what to say, we don't know what to do, we certainly don't know what it's like. And that's what this whole show is about, is to dive into other people's stories, learn what helps them so that way we can love them better. And if we haven't met before, hi, my name is Mickey. I would love to hear if you're here watching, whether live or as a replay. Cheryl and I can kind of see off to the side who's here watching. So just in the comment section, let us know that you're here and where you're calling in from. We would, whether it's live or as a replay, we will go through and kind of read your comments as the show goes on. My mom passed away when I was 13 of cancer, and I spent the better part of a decade pushing those hard feelings away and pretending I was fine. And eventually, as I'm sure you can imagine, you can't do that forever. And it caught up to me, and I could not grieve, I guess is probably the best way to say that. So after lots of counseling, I really wanted to come up with a show like this where we could just together learn about these perspectives. And man, Cheryl's story tonight is one I am so excited to meet. I'm not sure I've ever met an orphan before, but they're there. And that's the thing. It's like there are people who are in that spot. And I think it's so important for us to know some of that perspective and things to keep in mind so we can help other people better. But really quickly, before we bring on the wonderful Cheryl, got a couple things to share with you guys. One, for those of you who have went on and left a review from My Heart Still Remembers, thank you so much. That is so grateful. To give just a little recap, and I'm going to put the link in the comment section. Amazon kind of sucks, and I'm just going to say it. I love it. We all use it. We all need it. But man, they basically were removing 5-star reviews from my book, which are really, really important because they thought, based on their algorithms and how they could determine who's related to who, because they thought I was related to those people. So they took those off. And yet they let people who are unverified, which means there's no way of knowing whether they actually bought the book or not, they let them just go and leave 1 or 2-star reviews, which plummets my rating. And it's really, really frustrating because when you're trying to make sales, people only go after books, anything really, that have 4 and 5 stars. So what I'm just kind of asking you guys is if you know anybody who has bought the book, received an electronic copy, if you signed up for my email list way back in the day, you got a free PDF of it. If you've used it in grief groups and you're familiar with the book, anyone who's ever seen the book, if you don't mind just going on and just giving it a quick review, you don't even have to write anything. You can just leave a star rating. That would be so helpful. I'm pretty frustrated with Amazon, but even since I mentioned this last week, a lot of you guys have gone on and left reviews because it's impacted you. And that's just so powerful. So thank you for doing that. I really wanted just to say thank you. And if you don't mind, keep the good fight going. You're doing God's work. And I'm so grateful. And if you're like, what's all the fuss about this book? Feel free to get your own copy too. I know Cheryl and I are going to talk a little bit about how this book has helped her and her grief groups here in just a little bit. And last but certainly not least, before we get to the wonderful Cheryl, I just want to remind you guys kind of why I do this show and how just because I might have the head knowledge, and I'm sure Cheryl can relate to this too, just because you understand grief doesn't mean it's necessarily easier. And today is my grandma's birthday, and she passed away just over a year and a half ago, or I'm really bad at math, right around a year and a half ago. And it's one of those things where it's like, man, I cognitively knew what I had to do. So for the first time, kind of in this new season of life that I'm in, I was able to be like, okay, grandma's birthday is coming up. I might not feel like I need to do anything, but I should. And so I set some time aside. I journaled. I wrote a letter. I'm sobbing. I broke down when I was looking for some of her old strawberry jelly because I was like, okay, this will be great. I'll find some of her strawberry jelly. This will be a nice little thing that I can put on a piece of bread and remember her by. And when I couldn't find the jelly, I started sobbing and I was so frustrated and I was so angry. And I kind of laughed to myself afterwards. And I was like, why did that bother me so badly? Like, it's just strawberry jam. But I realized that was one more thing that I don't have that connection with her anymore. And so, happy birthday, Grandma. We love you so, so, so much. Miss you dearly. But that's why I just wanted to kind of like touch base with you guys and just be like, just because you go through grief once and maybe you've learned the ropes, it doesn't make it easier when the next person you love passes away. It just helps you hopefully have tools to process it and lean into it in a healthy way. Grief sucks no matter how you slice it, how you dice it. When grief hits you, it's going to suck. But my prayer is that through this show and through these interviews, we can all learn helpful coping tactics so that way we can navigate that terrible river a little bit better. So, with that said, it is absolutely time to bring on the one, the only Cheryl Hajes. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I've heard your amazing story before. It is truly powerful, and I can't wait for others too. So, do you mind just introducing yourself and your lost story?
Sure. My name is Cheryl Hajes, and when I was 10 years old, I lost my dad to suicide. And less than a year later, I lost my mom to heart disease. So I was an only child. So so I lost my whole family in less than a year. And then just to add insult to injury, in between the two deaths, a girl in my class was murdered walking to school. So it was kind of the year from hell, to put it mildly. Um, but I survived. Obviously, I'm here, and now I'm in my 50s, so I've done okay. But I was raised by an aunt and uncle who lived in another state. And my three cousins became my three brothers. And I since that time, I've lost a brother-in-law to a car accident. So I was very close with his kids, especially his three daughters. And I also have lost all of the older generation in my family. So my aunt and uncle who raised me died the most recently, but I've lost a lot of other wonderful people as well um, who were there, were my support system when I was growing up and going through this. So
Well, I am so sorry for all of your losses. You have been dealt a crappy hand. Let's just call a spade a spade. That sucks.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so what I would love to dive into tonight, I mean, truthfully, and everybody listening, I'd love to hear, have you guys met an orphan before? Because Cheryl, you're the first one I know who, as a child, lost both parents, where I think a lot of people, as they get older, lose both parents, but as a child. So,
I've only actually met one other orphan
like,
until recently when I joined a group specifically for orphans. Until then,
mm,
I had only met one other person that had gone through that. It's
wow.
Luckily we are very rare, so that's a good thing.
Yeah. And for anybody listening, if you know someone whose story kind of reminds you of Cheryl's, message me after the show and we'll make sure you guys get connected in case they potentially want to connect with this group. But to kind of go back to that spot, you're this sweet 11-year-old. Do you mind showing that photo that you
Oh
have?
yeah. So
So
this is
everyone
the
can.
oops. This is this screen is not mirror image, so I'm having a little bit of a technical problem here with my getting this in centered. But this is my mom and dad, George and Charlotte Berman, and little me. This was taken about a year before my dad died, so about 2 years before my mom died. So just kind of shows you how little I was when all
Yeah.
this happened. So
Oh my gosh. And I just want to give that little girl a hug. But man, so I'll give you a hug instead next time I see you.
sounds good.
So, can you put us into your mindset on what were you thinking after your mom died?
Well, actually, I'll go back to what I was thinking after my dad died because my mom and I found him together. So that is not something that any 10-year-old should have to see. And and I remember my mom screaming. I think I probably did too. I don't know. And my mom had me run into the house to dial 911. The the telephone operator must have told me to go outside and wait for the ambulance so I could show them where my dad's body was. But I remember standing and waiting for the ambulance and just, I don't know if I was crying or not. I have no idea, but I was just standing there thinking, I don't have a daddy anymore. I don't have a daddy anymore. And I said it over and over and over again in my head. And I just was in such shock. And I knew that there was no reason for an ambulance. And then I remember the ambulance driving away with his body and the sirens weren't on. And because there was no emergency, I mean, he was gone. And that was, and just that was just such an awful feeling. And I found out actually just about probably 5 or 6 years ago, I found a friend of mine from elementary school on Facebook. And he lived in the area and he was at the park that was kind of down the street from our houses. And he saw me standing out there waiting for the ambulance. And he talked about how freaked out he was by the whole situation. Um, and then, I remember very little from the funeral. I remember my grandma, my dad's mom, just screaming over and over again, George, why, George, why? And I'd never seen my grandma cry. And that was really, really awful. And then after the funeral, I remember everybody had left to go home, and my mom and I standing there looking at each other and just having no earthly idea how to go on. I mean, it was just horrible. And, and I don't remember a lot from that year in between. I remember obviously when the girl in my class was murdered, that was pretty traumatic. Luckily she was not a, well, I shouldn't say that, that sounds bad, but I mean, she was not a close friend of mine. We had a mixed classroom. So we had fourth and fifth graders together, and she was a fifth grader and I was a fourth grader. So we didn't really do a lot together. We knew who each other were, but we weren't friends because we weren't in the same grade, if that makes any sense. But after that, I remember the parents were just so freaked out and nobody would let anybody walk to school anymore. And so our lives got turned really completely upside down. But there was a lot of compassion and a lot of grief going on in the community at that time. So I felt really loved and supported. And then after my mom, but then I came home from school one day and we were supposed to go downtown for my piano lesson that day. And this was up in Duluth. And I got home and all the doors were locked and my mom never locked the doors. So I was pretty freaked out. I knew my mom had had heart disease she'd had heart disease her whole life. So it wasn't, and so I ran to the neighbors and called an aunt and uncle, and what seemed like an eternity later, after praying with the neighbor, but knowing that this wasn't going to turn out okay. My uncle came to my neighbor's house and told me that my mom had died. And, yeah, there just aren't words for that. I mean, it was awful. And, so I went and lived with that aunt and uncle for the rest of the school year. And then I moved in with an aunt and uncle in Colorado because they were my godparents. So I moved in with them and my cousins in Colorado and started the next school year out there. So.
Wow. Well, there's a million questions kind of running through my mind. All I want to say though is I'm so sorry. When this is kind of a little going back to when you found out your mom died. I know she had been sick, but man, could you even like fathom it?
Well, see, that's the thing. I didn't know she was sick because she had gotten tuberculosis, they think, when she was a child. She was never diagnosed. And so she had her first open heart surgery when she was 12 years old. So she had always had heart issues. So, I mean, so she wasn't really sick. She just always had heart issues. It wasn't like, it wasn't like all of a sudden, like I knew she was dying. She may have known that the heart condition was getting worse, but I certainly didn't know that.
Okay.
And I don't know if anybody else did either, because her death was a shock to everyone.
Wow. Geez, two very shocking deaths. That sounds really hard. Can you put us again, like what's your brain thinking at this point? Like what's your perspective?
It's I think one of the things that's interesting is now that I lead support groups and which are for adults, I realize that my feelings and my thoughts were very similar to what anybody else would think when they were faced with a sudden tragedy like that. I just complete disbelief, complete shock, complete, it's just, yeah, how do you go on from here? And yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's been a really long time, but
Yeah.
yeah, it was awful.
Oh, yeah, I know. I'm over here crying. I have been it's the worst kind of permanence,
Right.
the
I think
worst
that's
kind of
why I
permanence.
think that's why I like time travel shows so much now. I love time travel books and time travel movies, and I think it's because I would love so much to go back in time and just see my mom and dad again, just to ask my dad why, to ask, I mean, there's a million questions, but
Yeah.
in the same time, I'm very thankful I had the parents I did because they were wonderful. I mean, they loved me unconditionally. My dad got down on the floor and played with me and built snow forts with me, and I mean, it just, he was. My mom baked cookies with me. I mean, I have nothing but wonderful, happy memories of that time of my life. So,
Oh, that's a beautiful silver lining, I suppose.
yeah.
And in that moment when people hear your story, I'm over here crying. I think a gut reaction for folks to say is, "Wow, like you are so strong," and like, "Kid, like wow, like you're so resilient. Like look at you now." But I know just from talking to you kind of offline, you do not like it when people say that.
I
Can you
hate that word.
tell
I
me
hate the
why
word resilient.
resilient?
Um,
Let's dive into that.
I hate the word resilient because kids can't be resilient without help. I mean, you can't get through something like what I lived through without a lot of support and a lot of help. And I think that there are a lot of kids that end up, you know, being getting into drug issues and drinking issues because they don't have that support and don't have that help. And there's a new I don't know how new it is, but there's a new or a s- a- I'm just gonna I should have grabbed the book. Um, I don't know where it is, but yeah. Anyway, there's a study called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, and I think they rank you on a score of 1 to 5 or something like that, depending on how many adverse childhood experiences you had, and each one of those makes you more susceptible to long-term effects from whatever the trauma was you suffered. And it can range from, addictive issues or um, to all kinds of health issues. Diabetes, heart disease, you name it, can be caused because you went through some kind of trauma as a child. And so, kids that go through something horrible really, really need the support and the love from the people around them, from professionals. And I'm glad that now they're finally figuring out that people like me really needed more help than we got. The prevailing wisdom back then was to um, was that it you did to not talk about it. It was, better just to pretend like nothing happened. Um, and that's exactly what my aunt and uncle did when they took me in. They said, well, "You're our daughter now. We're going to treat you just like one of our kids." And that's the way that the school handled it. The school was when I went back to school in Duluth after my dad died, I felt very loved and supported because I knew everybody. When I went to school out in Colorado, I didn't know anybody, and it was horrible. I mean, the kids were not nice to me. The teachers treated and I just needed so much more support. But luckily now they know um, that kids and adults, everyone who's grieving needs more support, and to pretend like nothing happened is the wrong way to handle it. So
Well, I so appreciate that perspective, and hopefully, all of us listening on the call are thinking of ways like, okay, if I know someone in that situation, how can I help? How can I offer support. So I guess that kind of leads me to the question of what were some logistical things that happened that most of us who have not been orphaned just would not be aware of?
Well, I'm gonna answer that kind of in a strange way because, it's kind of a funny story, actually. So my husband and I were asked by 2 different families to be their guardians of their kids should anything happen to them. And so I didn't write anything down, but in my head, I had it all planned out. I know how many bedrooms I have in my house, obviously, and I have 3 kids. And I had figured out one of the families has 3 kids, the other one had 5 kids. And so I had figured out in my head how many sets of bunk beds we would need to buy, who would room with who, what we would need to, how we would how we would have to get there to get these kids and take, I mean, I just had logically figured out everything we would need to buy, everything we would need to do in order to prepare my kids and those kids so that it wouldn't be as chaotic as it was when I went through it. And one day we were talking with somebody and I admitted that and my husband was sitting there. You should have seen the look on his face. He was so shocked that I had thought about that. And I said, "Well, it happened to me, so I just, I have to assume that it can happen because and when it does happen, it happens right now. You have, no time to prepare. You just, you have all of a sudden you've got to, in my case, I was a child. Somebody had to take care of me and so, I think there was a lot of chaos around that. Um,
Mm.
Between
And
selling my parents' house and getting rid of all their stuff, and I just sat there, watched it all, and it was, that was very traumatic, and sometimes I think the trauma of losing my parents was actually easier than the trauma of having to uproot my life and lose my home and my friends and, all I mean, literally everything else. So, yeah, it
hmm,
was it's kinda like a double, triple, quadruple whammy when you look at it, you just
yeah, and then in your kind of orphan group that you're part of, is that kind of the consensus that people would prefer to have stayed in their town versus moving?
everybody is so different in that respect. Everybody's situation is so different. So, um, I can only speak for myself, but, uh,
Understandable.
there is a really wonderful book though. If there's anybody listening who did lose somebody as a child, this book, The After Grief, it's amazing.
I love
I've
that.
met Hope now, um, and Hope, if you're watching, hi. Um,
That would be
I
awesome. I hope that would be so cool.
well, she does know about that I'm doing this tonight. But I just loved her book was really life changing because it goes through it's written for people who have been grieving for a really, really long time and what the long term effects of that grief are. So
Wow. Wow, 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 wow. Well, I will absolutely put that book in my show notes. So, anybody listening, don't forget to head to mickeyspier.com and sign up for my email list. Not only will you get the replays of this, the YouTubes, in case you got friends who aren't on Facebook, as well as I'll make sure that link to Hope's book is in there. Couple more questions for you as we kind of wrap up our time. One of the things that, obviously I'm coming from the perspective of losing one child and or one parent, and we never want to diminish anyone's loss. But how do you think your life was different than somebody who only lost one parent, or I guess to another level, somebody who started off with a single parent and lost that?
again, I can only speak for myself, but like I said, the trauma of having to move from my house. I mean, to lose your parents is hard enough. To lose one parent is hard enough, but at the age of 11, I can say I really literally lost everything. I mean, me and my parakeet had to move across country and into a family that I really didn't know that well. I mean, obviously I knew them. I mean, they had a cabin here in Minnesota. We spent a lot of time with them in the summers, but it wasn't like I really knew them. And so I felt like I was moving into I was moving into a home with virtual strangers. And um, it just, to completely uproot your life like that at that age, and to have to lose all of your friends. This was long before Facebook and cell phones. And, a lot of those friends I didn't find again. And some of them I've never found again.
Mm.
But a handful of them I've reconnected with on Facebook. My best friend from my childhood, her and I have met a couple times for lunch, but she lives in Texas now. But when she's in Minnesota, we've gotten together, and it's been really, really wonderful to reconnect. But for many years, we didn't know where any of, and I mean, I didn't know where any of these people were. Um, and I was just so lonely because to reestablish friendships after going through something so traumatic is just virtually impossible. At least it was for
Mm.
me. And so I went from being this, outgoing kid with a lot of friends to being this kind of loner who didn't have a lot of friends. Um, and then in college I finally kind of snapped out of it and things got a little better, but it was tough. It was really,
Yeah.
yeah, really tough. And to have to move to another state where I really didn't get to see. I grew up with a bunch of cousins and aunts and uncles that were all around us in Minnesota here. And all of a sudden, none of them lived there anymore. So, none of them lived by me anymore. So I didn't get to see them very often. So it just kind of added insult to injury, I guess, for lack of.
Mm. Yeah, no, you're hitting the nail on the head where it's so oftentimes we think about, oh, I lost the person and that's hard. But there's grief surrounding the house and the school and the friends and the lifestyle.
Right.
And I
It's
think
those, it's,
yeah.
they call that secondary losses. And,
Mhm.
and the more of those you have, the harder it is to get over the grief. Um,
Mm. That is so good to know. And I mentioned my grandma earlier, after she passed away, not we lost, they sold the house, which is totally fine. But like I think about that house all the time and I crave it.
mhm.
Like my soul, it's almost like a homing pigeon saying, why aren't we going that way? Like this is the time of year we visit. And it's that
Right.
I'm grieving that
Right.
house. So I guess the last question that I kind of have as we wrap up our time together is what do you wish or things you've heard other people in your group wish us non-orphans knew?
Um, don't use the term orphan when you lose your parents when you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s. You know, um, yeah, you've lost your parents, but an orphan is a specific type of loss. And and just be there for people who are grieving. That doesn't mean you have to know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just call them up once in a while and see how they are. I just
Mm.
I got an email or a text message from a cousin of mine recently who just lost someone very tragically. And she said, "Wow, I just now finally understand what you went through as a child, and I wish I would have been there more for you." And it's like, well, don't wait until you have a tragedy and understand to be there for people. Don't be afraid to reach out to people who are hurting, and say the name of the person who died. Please, please say the name of the person who died. Tell stories about them and talk about them. Just because they died doesn't mean that they don't
Mm.
still exist, and doesn't mean if you say their name and make the person cry, most likely they're crying tears of gratitude because somebody said their name, and somebody remembers.
Oh, that is so, so beautiful. We are so grateful for you. And I guess in speaking of remembers, I know you use my book, My Heart Still Remembers, a
I
little bit
did.
differently than other people. But so as we kind of close out our time, do you mind sharing with
Yep.
how you
Oh,
use
I've
the
got
book
I've
and
got
giving?
Mickey's book right here. As again, I'm having trouble with what direction to move my thing here. But I have used some of the questions in here in some of my support groups. They're just real good conversation starters. And so when I'm dealing with people who are grieving, I will use some of those were some of her questions and comments. to help spark conversation. So yeah, a
Oh,
little
well,
differently than what she intended, but it works great for that purpose too.
oh, that makes me so happy. So thank you, Cheryl, for all it's truly for the buying the book. My gosh, for leaving the reviews. I am so great. And for being on the show and for sharing your story. We are so blessed and so grateful for you. I just don't even have words other than thank you. And everybody who's watching, whether live or as a replay, give Cheryl a big old thank you for coming on the show and bearing her soul. We're just so grateful for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
My absolute pleasure. Well, folks, that's a wrap. I will see you next week where I interview someone who lost a daughter to a car accident and just kind of diving into car accidents and how it's so common and all that great stuff. But in the meantime, I hope you have a fantastic week, that you're able to heal your own wounds and love other people just a little bit better today after hearing Cheryl's talk. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Bye.